Hi, some of you know me already from my class. I teach at the University of Hawaii. Just finished my 48th year there, in fact, although I've been away about a third of the time. And this presentation I'm going to make is based on an invitation I got several months ago. There's going to be a monograph issue of the journal Thesis 11, which is kind of an anniversary issue, the 70th anniversary issue on the bombing of Hiroshima. And so I was just invited to write anything I wanted about Hiroshima. What I learned about Hiroshima early on was when I was working on my book, Violent Cartographies, in 1997. I noticed that there was an interesting controversy at the Smithsonian Institute, where they have an aeronautical museum. The aeronautical museum is basically focused on the history of flight. And among the things hanging there are the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the bomb on Hiroshima. And some people wanted to include some narratives about the Japanese experience of the bomb. But when the word got out that that was planned, members of the U.S. Senate managed to block it. They said, the museum is just about the history of flight. And nothing should be shown that has to do with the narrative of the victims, as it were. So anyway, as I thought about how to start the paper, I remembered two episodes in 1966. I had a dinner party at my house, I think in the middle of the summer, and it got to be close to midnight, and we got this, why don't we all go to the Nippon Theater, where there's a late show, Japanese movie theater, which during the early evening would show sentimental films about a teacher, for example, that's beloved by his students. And then they had a pornography program after midnight. So it was soft porn, but nevertheless pornography. So anyway, we said, let's have some fun, because the porn films in the Nippon are always very funny. And so we went, and the film turned out to be Lost Sex. The scene opens, and there's a middle-aged Japanese man telling his housekeeper about his experience of the war. You get a flashback. He's lying in a hospital bed. As a result of the radiation, he's become impotent. And there's a young nurse who's reaching under the covers, manipulating him, trying to restore his masculinity. And as he tells the story, days go by, and she's dripping with sweat, and nothing is working. And then finally one day he says, it worked. And he's smiling, and she's smiling. And so then he goes on with the story about how, as a result, he got married, but then his virility disappeared yet again. And the housekeeper's listening carefully. She said, why didn't you marry the nurse? We almost fell out of our chair laughing at this one. Anyway, it stands to reason. Anyway, later on in the film, he gets involved with a housekeeper. And in order to sort of provoke his masculinity, she has men come in and rape her. She stages sexual scenes for his benefit. But he misunderstands and thinks that she's being unfaithful, and so he drops her. And at the end of the film, he's a lonely old man looking at the snow falling on the mountain. And that's one ending, as it were. There's another ending that I watched about 3 weeks later. On August 6th, the anniversary of the bombing, 1966, the 11th anniversary. On the news program, there was a scene that took place on an army base. And army families are sitting in bleachers. There's this empty field. A plane flies over, drops a smoke bomb, and then the voiceover says, there's the bomb that ended the war. And everyone claps. That was the army version of what Hiroshima was about. And in fact, the primary American model of what Hiroshima was about is the success of the war through air power. That's the only story. And so as I began to think about what I could write, I decided to canvass the Japanese experience. And there was a huge literature in many different genres. In fact, manga films, there's a genealogy of them in which, in cartoon versions, that the Hiroshima thing is represented. But the most powerful thing that I ran across entirely was a novel by Abuse called Black Rain. Mr. Abuse actually did an ethnography of the victims shortly after the bombing. He looked at diaries, he interviewed people. And Black Rain basically has a character, Mr. Shizuma, who's based on Abuse himself. And you get all of the dimensions of the aftermath of the bombing as a result. The centerpiece of my essay is based on the film Hiroshima Mon Amour, which I turn to in part because there's been a reprise of it. Someone named Silva Kowalski did a short video, about 15 minutes, called After Hiroshima Mon Amour, because what she wanted to do was look at how one could read that film after the bombing of Iraq, for example. So it's Hiroshima after Iraq. And it's discussed, among other things, in a book called Hiroshima After Iraq by Rosalind Deutsch, in which she looks at Silva Kowalski's installation, plus a variety of other things that create what I'd like to call the will have been of Hiroshima. The future anterior. That grammar is very important because I think every historical episode returns as a result of new historical experiences. And so everything we've ever experienced will have been. It comes back again for the purposes of reinterpretation. And I'll be reading part of my essay on that, which makes it clear. But before I go any further, I want to show a good section of the film and then begin to talk about how I've interpreted it. I want to share some of what I've written about the film with you, and then we can open it for discussion. I have a section I call Returns to Hiroshima. There's a book by Rosalind Deutsch called Hiroshima After Iraq. And what I argue here is that she captures the mobile temporality of the Hiroshima bombing in her book, where she describes artistic representations that in effect activate the implications of the changes that take place as you move through time. Conceptualizing the critical temporality that derives from the grammatical tense that locates the past and the future anterior, or the will have been. She analyzes the significance of 3 returns to Hiroshima, one of which is the video that I mentioned by Silva Kowalski called After Hiroshima Mon Amour, where she recasts the film with a different temporal pacing, basically. But to appreciate her intervention, you have to understand the creative play in the film itself. So I'll talk a bit about that. This is what Marguerite Duras says about her screenplay. As the film opens, 2 pairs of bare shoulders appear little by little. All we see are these shoulders, cut off from the body at the height of the head and hips, in an embrace, and as if drenched with ashes, rain, dew, or sweat, whichever is preferred. The main thing is that we get the feeling that this dew, this perspiration, has been deposited by the atomic mushroom as it moves away and evaporates. It should produce a violent, conflicted feeling of freshness and desire. Now, in contrast with a geopolitical security story in which the bodies of Japanese victims are rendered in an abstract discourse as mere casualties, the film renders bodies in 2 experiential registers: the bombing's effect on relations of intimacy, and the specific of the bombing's inscriptions on bodies. Bringing the 2 registers together, the event time of the devastated bombing, and the micro-temporality of rhythms of intimacy, which is what the lovers represent. The lovers at first seem to be under a rain of ash, and later their skin looks clear and smooth, showing a light film of the sweat of erotic effort. In a few brief cinematic moments, their skin therefore registers both pleasure and pain. Doubtless, Hiroshima Mon Amour challenges the various narratives of the Hiroshima bombing that have shaped the U.S. collective memory, which usually includes a persistent visuality of the bomb, rendered as a mushroom cloud. In the absence of images of the specific devastation to bodies and dwellings that the iconic shape serves, it's a sublime reference to U.S. national security, seen by most as a still picture, radically cut off from event time. It's a static image that effaces the process of devastation that occurred on the ground during the explosion. One of the things I do here in this paper is cut to this novel called Black Rain, which really was a very powerful kind of epiphany for me, because Mr. Shizuma in the novel Black Rain does not see it as a mushroom cloud only. Although the expression mushroom cloud is incorporated in a few places in Masumi Ebuse's classic novel, Black Rain, first published in 1969, its narrator, Shigematsu Shizuma, sees it also as a jellyfish cloud. The image is a stunning alert. It bids us to recognize that Ebuse's aesthetic subject, who provides a trenchant witnessing of the aftermath of the bombing, is seeing the cloud in real time. It's moving. Right? And so to see it as a mushroom is only to see the picture. The scenes, he reports, are thus cinematic rather than photographic. The cloud appears as a mass of undulating motion whose color was fading before his eyes. Although he's a fictional character, Ebuse's Mr. Shizuma, who manages a fraught familial intimacy issues while collecting and interpreting the scenes of the devastated cityscape, awash in dead and dying and sick bodies. One of the things he sees is a woman's body floating in the river, and her intestines have left her body through the anus, and they're basically trailing well behind. Ebuse himself learned at the scene of the bombing, where before writing his novel he'd collected diaries and interviews. Through Mr. Shizuma's narration, Ebuse's Black Rain delivers the temporalities of the bombing's aftermath, not only with the dynamics of the visuals, images of the cloud as a jellyfish and so forth, but also in the developing discourses with which those victimized or in the vicinity of the bombing came to terms with their experience. One of the discourses about the weapon. Over time, the description of what had been dropped on Hiroshima from the point of view of the residents changed. At first, it's called a new weapon, then a new type bomb, followed by a high-capacity bomb, and finally, once more information becomes available, they call it an atomic bomb. At the same time, various aspects of the management of everyday life unfold as resources become scarce. Despite a post-bombing state of emergency that requires a rapid restoration of services, bureaucracies continue to function with their same usual temporal pacing. All of you who are at a university know about that. For example, in response to the coal shortage brought to the attention of the control station by a petition from Mr. Shizuma, the lieutenant in charge says, quote, "Concerning coal, as I've said many times, we must hold a conference before we can come to any conclusion. I'm afraid you'll have to wait until we've held our conference," end quote. More pervasively, the rhythms of everyday life were shown to be disturbed. The novel treats in great detail the culinary practices that have to be radically altered because of severe shortages. And the non-material aesthetic practices are also compromised. At one point, Mr. Shizuma writes, quote, "Emerging from the main gate of the clothing depot, I'm struck by the desolation of the lotus pond." And he goes on to reminisce about his former daily enjoyment of the surroundings, quote, "The glossy black sheen of the crow's plumage in the morning blends well with the green of the rice plants, and equally well with the rice fields after they've turned yellow." However, most central to the plot are the traditional processes of courtship, marriage, and human intimacy, which occupy the novel's main narrative. The primary focus of this dynamic is Mr. Shizuma's niece, Yasuko, who, as a result of atomic polluted black rain, has intermittent bouts of radiation sickness, and as rumors of her illness spread, she's unable to consummate an engagement. Although that narrative thread is the main way in which the novel treats the disruption of intimacies, there are others as well. Mr. Shizuma notes, for example, that he's heard two characters say that those injured by the bomb, even if only slightly hurt, have lost all interest in sex. Ultimately, Ebuse's Black Rain lays the small human preoccupations and foibles against the mighty purposes of the state. Against the threat of universal destruction, he sets a love from and sense of wonder at life in all its forms. The film is a life-affirming, I argue, micropolitics of the Japanese social world. It explores the destruction and disruption of the vital rhythms of Japanese life that have resulted from the necropolitics of state antagonisms. Appalled by that reality, and here's what I use as a threshold to get back to the film, Mr. Shizuma makes the case for a continuing ethical reflection on the Hiroshima bombing. He writes that he is afflicted by the thought that what has happened to the inhabitants constitutes a moral damage that will persist into the future, adding that, quote, in olden times, people used to say that an area badly damaged by war, it took a century to repair the moral damage done to the inhabitants, end quote. Okay. What I argue here is that Mr. Shizuma's remark about moral damage wrought by the bombing of Hiroshima provides a good return to the Dora Rene Hiroshima Mon Amour, because in accord with the focus of Debussy's Black Rain on the bombing's disruption of processes, instructions of desire and intimacy, the film creates a transversality between a love story and the material and social destruction of the city. I won't go into the narrative here because you've seen that. But at the very beginning, you remember, you saw nothing, I saw this, you saw nothing, I saw that. That's a dissensual discourse going on. There's a dissensus between what Elle narrates and what the viewer sees. She notes, for example, that by the 15th day, a vast profusion of blooming flowers are poking up through the ashes, unheard of in flowers before then. But at that same moment, when she's saying that, what is shown is morbidity rather than vitality. Damaged, grotesque bodies are on screen, being treated by medical staff. The musical score also underlines the dissensus. Early on, it has a rapid, frenetic pace, which adds to the tension between Elle's statements of what she sees and what's shown. In contrast, during Louis, she's always referred to only as Elle, he as Louis. During Louis' rebuttals, his remarks are backed by a contrapuntal single instrument, seemingly a woodwind, probably a clarinet, which contrasts with the flute and string accompaniments to Elle's insistences. With such disruptive juxtapositions in other aspects of film form, Hiroshima Mon Amour establishes a temporal trajectory for what Black Rain's Mr. Shibusi calls moral damage. The film literally puts flesh on that expression, animating the process of bodily disintegration. At the same time, it tracks processes of witnessing while producing a diremption, a radical change between witnessing on the one hand and knowing on the other. In response to Louise' frequent assertions that she saw nothing, Elle reports the evidence of her eyes. I saw the hospital, I'm sure of it, etc., etc. As Elle's narrative voice proceeds, the film evokes a distrust of fixed images and iconic representations. An epistemology of the gaze must give way to an epistemology of becoming, an articulation of sense memory with a grammatical framing of history that reaches toward an uncertain future. That valuing of becoming operates in the interface between narrative and image. During her remarks about seeing and knowing what is in the museum, there's a tracking shot of a mother and child approaching the museum, and further tracking shots that explore the outside and inside of the building. What can we make of such cinematic moments? Jean-Luc Godard's provocative suggestion is that aesthetic and moral aspects of the film coincide. In response to a query about whether the film is jarring aesthetically or morally, he says, tracking shots are a question of morality. Affirming Godard's observation, the film incessantly juxtaposes the memory of Hiroshima bombing to the movement of bodies involved in war tourism, especially by the cutting from tracking shots of the memorial venues in Peace Square to cuts to hands caressing skin. What therefore is contrasted is a fixed, institutionalized realization of the bombing, a fetishizing of the event in buildings, posters, and glass cases, and a dynamic bodily sense memory as the two lovers caress each other's skin while at the same time verbally questioning their different loci of enunciation and the experiential trajectories that have brought them together. And that they represent two different times. I didn't stop it in time, but anyway, there's this moment when you get an overhead shot of their two watches crossed, as it were, on the night table by their bed. To amplify Godard's observations about the morality of tracking shots, we can heed the other aspects of the film's form, the way it articulates a morality. It's through montage, the cutting back and forth between the scenes of devastation and the lovers, cuts between the instantaneous destruction of bodies and the slow rhythms of intimacy, that the film makes its primary moral statements. which are about the disruption of the temporal rhythms of the life world. Among the exemplary cuts that speak to one aspect of that disruption, interventions into ordinary biological time, are these, quote, "At the same time that the lovers are engaged in a slow caressing of each other's smooth, unblemished skin, L mentions that when the bomb dropped, there resulted 200,000 dead and 80,000 wounded in 9 seconds. And earlier, as the camera tracks the displays in the museum, there's a long take of the glass containers with what L refers to as human flesh, suspended as if still alive, its agony still fresh. Subsequently, we see anonymous masses of hair that the women, upon waking, would find had fallen out, followed by a badly burned flesh of a man's back. Those references to both instantaneous and rapid morbidity are followed by scenes of the lovers slowly caressing each other's smooth skin. The contrast between the slow indulgence with which healthy skin is appreciated and the suddenly damaged skin resulting from the bombing is underscored with a display of scorched metal, which L describes as looking as vulnerable as flesh. The discursive and imagistic focus on flesh, along with the foregrounding of an erotic relationship between L and Louis, both of whom are married, effectively lends the film a counter-Pauline morality. Here I'm talking about St. Paul. As is well known, Pauline theology juxtaposes the spirit to the flesh. Denigrating the flesh, St. Paul mentions, among other things, fornication, impurity, licentiousness, drunkenness, carousing. Here I'm quoting Galatians 5:19-21. Anything that involves the carnal sins, which are associated with sensual enjoyment involving the flesh. In contrast, L virtually celebrates what she calls her dubious morals. In accord with L's indulgence in erotic jouissance, the film suggests that the enjoyment of the flesh, of the intimate rhythms of bodily exchange, is what the bombing specifically and the war as a whole has disrupted. In place of the slow, intimate rhythms of life, the war has produced an accelerated decrepitude. In this sense, the film animates abuse's primary theme in Black Rain. Ultimately, both through its cinematic form and discursive narration, the film suggests that Hiroshima, in contrast to the way it's rendered in the abstract policy discourses or treatises on apocalypse, is an atrocity that took the form of instantaneous destruction, sudden impairment, and then the accelerated decrepitude of bodies. At one point, L provides a brief phenomenology of the war's attack on the body. After looking in the mirror, she wistfully explains that she was young once. Imre Kertész's fictional character, George Kovas, a Hungarian Jewish teenager who ends up in a concentration camp, offers a more elaborate account of the phenomenology of accelerated decrepitude. Here's what the prisoner says in the novel. "I can safely say that there's nothing more painful, nothing more disheartening than to track day after day, to record day after day, yet again, how much of one has wasted away. Back home, while paying no great attention to it, I was in general harmony with my body. I was fond of this bit of machinery, so to say. I recollect reading some exciting novel in our shaded parlor one summer afternoon, the palm of my hand, meanwhile, caressing with pleasing absent-mindedness the golden-downed, pliantly smooth skin of my taut, muscular, sunburned thigh. Now that same skin was drooping in loose folds, jaundiced and desiccated," end quote. Along with the destruction and impairment of physical bodies, the film dwells on the ethics of memory, which through L's narration is articulated as a primary aspect of the film's morality. She dwells on the importance of not forgetting Hiroshima. As important, she says at one point, is never forgetting either her former love for her German soldier in Nevers or the current one in Hiroshima, even though the second love bids to efface the memory of the first. In order cinematically to represent the theme of forgetting in the present, and to do it with a Proustian emphasis on sense memory, the film suggests an equivalence between the two objects of forgetting, lovers and historical events. L notes that she's been under the illusion I would never forget Hiroshima, and she laments her forgetting of her first love, the German soldier. "I was unfaithful to you tonight with this stranger. I told our story. It was, you see, a story that could be told. For 14 years I hadn't found the taste of an impossible love again since Nevers. Now look how I'm forgetting you. Look, I've forgotten you."
The ethics of remembering forgetting is doubtless an inspiration for Silva Kowalski's After Hiroshima Mon Amour, and I won't go into that. I just want to get to my conclusion. Give us some time to talk. Conclusion: media temporalities and the ethics of attention, which I mentioned briefly when I stopped the film. As Obusi's Black Rain and other treatments have made evident, apart from Hiroshima's continual return as it's evoked in comparison with later atrocities, the effects of the bombing were both instantaneous and slow, killing roughly 260,000 in seconds, and subsequently many over an extended period, through mortal injuries and radiation sickness. The effect of depleted uranium left in the Iraqi environment falls into the later effect and are parallel with a host of others. I mentioned earlier in the piece that one of the things we did in Iraq was to use depleted uranium coating on the bullets. It's likely now that that uranium will kill many more people than died in Hiroshima over time. The effect of depleted uranium fall into an effect which we can call slow violence, a book by Rob Nixon. Nixon's analysis of slow violence is focused on the gradual form of deadly attrition that receive either no or very brief coverage in the mainstream media. For example, the environmental degradation caused by unregulated capitalism, starvation owed to both structures of inequality and violent conflicts that destroy food sources, and the lethal zones left with atrocities, with toxicities, mines, and other unexploded military ordnance in the aftermath of war. To situate the media practices that neglect or treat perfunctorily this form of violence, I turn to a passage by Milan Kundera in his novel Slowness, which covers the situation succinctly. Slowness opens with a married couple's vacation scenario. At one point, the husband narrator provides a commentary on images of suffering in the daily media, remarking that during their stay in a chateau, it coincides with a period when every day for 2 weeks the television news media showed the children of an African nation whose name is already forgotten, ravaged by war. Those children appeared, quote, thin, exhausted, without strength to wave away the flies walking across their faces, end quote. Later in the novel, when the images are no longer being carried by the television networks, the narrator remarks that the situation's history stages are floodlit only for a few minutes, and he continues, quote, no event remains news over its whole duration, merely for a brief span of time at the very beginning. The dying children of Somalia, whom millions of spectators used to watch avidly, aren't they dying anymore? What's become of them? Have they grown fatter or thinner? Does Somalia still exist? And in fact, did it ever exist? Could it be only the name of a mirage? Near the end of the film, you may recall that she keeps talking about how whether she should stay in Hiroshima. That's a way of saying, should our attention stay in Hiroshima? Elsewhere, I've suggested there's an antidote for the violence-neglecting temporal rhythms of the news media, a slow looking that is afforded by other media genres. For example, while the momentarily timely images carried by the news media may be ephemeral, the genre of the exhibition, which yields an accompanying and enduring catalog text, is one in which what becomes effaced as a news event is restored, reflected on, and made publicly available for extended ethical and political negotiation. And here I give some examples of exhibitions, which I'll skip. Finally, I want to return to cinema, which is not only, as I've suggested, a genre best suited to provide critical association, but it's also in its present historical moment another source of slow looking. For example, as Victor Bergen has pointed out, this is a book called The Remembered Film. Whereas once the recovery of instances from a remembered film was possible only if the film returned to a theater near you, the new technologies of video reproduction and streaming make it possible now to recover sequence images that interconnect remembered fragments from former viewing experiences in order to explore and create a critical perspective. Enabled by this new temporality of film viewing to analyze the film-memory relationship, Bergen gives us an example of his own experience in which there are sequences from two films. In the first, a woman climbs a path toward the camera. The camera adopts a variety of locations to position her in a landscape. This is from Tsai Ling's Viva l'Amour, 1994. In the second, There's a long shot of a woman entering the frame, and thereafter, as with the first film, Bergen recalls, the camera positions her in the landscape from various locations. And here we're talking about Michael Powell's film Canterbury Tales, 1944. Because the first reminded him of the second, Bergen was able to replay them in order to gauge the significance of the way they constitute an antithesis. Town and country, old world and new, east and west. In effect, Bergen explicates the temporal practices that made possible the analysis that I can do because I can watch these films again. I'll leave it there.